The men came for the gray at first light on the 25th of March, and she got to the stable yard before they did, because she had not slept, and she was standing with her back against the door of his box and her arms out along the wood when they came round the corner of the coach house with the guns. There were two of them, and the master of horse behind, a decent man named Mr. Corbin Rook, who was carrying a coil of rope he did not want to use and a face he did not want to wear. She said he would have to shoot her through the door first, then, and he would have to explain that to the coroner before his breakfast. Rook stopped. Behind the door, in the dark, the gray heard her voice and went quiet, which not one man on that estate had ever heard him do, and the silence of him was louder than any noise he had ever made. 17 hands, Rook said, and mad as the moon, and he has broke a groom's arm and stove in 2 doors, and there is not a farrier in the county will go under him. And the order is the order, miss, and it comes from higher than me. Whatever is wrong in that horse got into him the night her ladyship died, and it has never come out, and it never will. And a beast like that is a loaded gun standing in a stall, and you do not keep a loaded gun in a house with a child in it. She said no. She said it flat, without the tremble that had been in everything she had said since November. And afterward she could never account for where the flatness came from, unless it came from her father, who had been dead 5 months, and who had gentled 10,000 horses in his life, and never once in all of it raised his hand or his voice to a single one of them. Behind Rook the yard was filling with gray light, and the pigeons were coming off the clock tower in a clatter, and somewhere up in the house a shutter was being opened by somebody who had heard the men in the yard. 4 months from that morning, the Duke of Aldermore would stand up in a churchyard so full that the light gate could not be shut, and he would say a name aloud that had been forbidden on his land for 2 years, and he would say it with his hand on the neck of that same gray horse. But on that morning she was nobody at all. She was the governess. She was the young woman who taught the sums and the globes and the French to a small silent girl for her keep and 8 pounds a year, and who ate in the schoolroom off a tray, and whom the household walked past the way you walk past the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. Her name was Verity Prouse, and she was 23 years old, and until November she had been the daughter of a horse doctor in the next county who could put his hand flat on the neck of a screaming colt and have it asleep on its feet in 4 minutes, and who wrote down everything he knew in a little canvas-bound book in a hand so square and small you would have taken it for print. He died in the 2nd week of November, on his feet, in a strange man's yard, with his hand on a strange man's mare, of a thing in his chest he had known about since the summer and told nobody. What she remembered was not the dying. What she remembered was the 9th of December, when 2 men from the sale room came and put chalk numbers on everything her father had ever owned. They chalked the settle and the press and the case of drenching horns and the long shelf of bottles, and they chalked his good coat where it hung on the door, and they carried the settle out through the low front door, and the ends of it knocked the frame going through, and took a curl of paint off with a sound like a tooth coming out. And she stood in the middle of the emptied room and thought that the mark would be there for 40 years, and nobody would ever know what it was. The debts came to 118 pounds. A horse doctor in a small way of business does not leave a fortune. He leaves goodwill, which cannot be sold, and instruments which can, and a great many people who owe him money and are very sorry to hear he is gone and somehow never quite settle. She was allowed to keep his clothes, which nobody wanted, and the canvas book, which nobody understood, and her mother's garnet cross, which she sold in Marlbrook in the week before Christmas, for 6 pounds to pay the man who dug the grave and the man who cut the stone. She wrote to her aunt at Devizes. Her aunt wrote back 2 warm pages about how grieved she was, and how small the house had become, and how her own girls were at just the age when a house must be careful of its connections. And by the foot of the second page, Verity understood that she had been told no by a woman who would say for the rest of her life that she had offered what she could. It was the curate, a nervous, kind young man named Mr. Ollier, who found her the place. There was a great house in the vale beyond Aldermore, he said, where a little girl wanted a governess, an orphan, a duke's ward, a quiet child who had lost her mother and wanted somebody steady. And the family were particular, and the pay was small, but the position was safe. And he said the words safe and small in the same breath and looked at the table because he knew exactly what he was handing her. She said she would take it. She had, at that point, 4 shillings, a dead man's coat, and a book about horses. She went on the 14th of January on the carrier's cart, in a black frost that had held the whole country iron hard for 9 days, so that the ruts in the road were set like stone, and the cart banged over them, and every bone in her sat down harder than the last. The carrier was a talker. He gave her the whole vale in 11 miles. He told her about the Duke of Aldermore, who was 32 and unmarried, and who had been a pleasant enough young gentleman once, before it happened, and who now went about his own house and his own land like a man who has been told to keep his voice down in a room where somebody is very ill. He told her the Duke had had a sister. He got that far, and then he stopped and clicked his tongue at the horse and looked hard at the frozen hedge, and Verity learned the first law of that estate before she had so much as seen its chimneys from a man who did not even work there. Nobody said what had happened. They said the accident. They said before it, and they said since it. And they built their whole lives around a hole in the middle of a sentence and stepped over it so smoothly that in time they forgot they were stepping at all. The gates of Aldermore stood open when they came to them. Tall iron gates between stone piers with a rearing horse carved on the top of each, and the drive went up between 2 rows of great bare beeches for the better part of a mile, and then the house. She had expected to be afraid of it. She was not. It was very large and very gray and beautifully made, and it stood on its slope with a long lake below it, and a hanging wood behind, and every window along the front of it was blank in the flat morning light, and it looked to her, at that first sight in the cold, like the face of a proud man who has decided not to hear what you have come to say. There were 39 windows along that front. She counted them out of nerves and never afterward forgot the number. The cart set her down at the side, by the stable arch, and rattled away. And she stood in the cold with her box at her feet for a quarter of an hour before anybody came for her. And she spent the quarter of an hour listening, because a yard tells you what a house is before a person ever does. And this yard was wrong. There were horses in it, a dozen good animals in good stables, the ring of a shod foot on a swept cobble, the pull and grind of hay. It was a rich man's yard and a well-run one. And under all of it, from the far end past the coach house, in a range of boxes standing on their own, there was a sound she knew the way you know a voice in the dark, and it stopped her breath. It was the sound of a horse walking, not being walked, walking on its own, turn and turn about, 4 steps and a turn, hour upon hour, the deep, endless tread of an animal shut up alone with something it cannot put down. She had grown up in the sound of it. It was the sound her father had spent his life trying to take out of horses, and he had a name for it that was neither the copers nor the physicians. And the name was grief. And he had said to her once that a horse cannot tell you what has happened to it, and so it tells you this instead, and if you stand still long enough and let it, it will tell you the whole thing. When a woman finally came out to her, it was the housekeeper. Mrs. Yardley and Mrs. Yardley looked at her, and looked at the box and said, "Well, there is not much of you," in a tone that settled the entire question of Verity Prowse, for the foreseeable future. The box went up 2 flights and along a cold passage to a room at the north end of the house, where the water in the ewer wore a lid of ice by morning, and the one window looked out over the stable roofs. Mrs. Yardley went through the situation on the stairs the way a woman reads a bill she does not intend to query. Prayers at 7:30. The child at 8. She was not to take the child into the west wing, which was shut. She was not to open the door at the end of the long gallery, which was locked, and the key of which was not hers to ask after. She was not to go into the stable yard on any account, and she was most particularly not to go past the coach house to the range of boxes at the far end, and she was not to speak of it, or ask of it, or send the child anywhere near it. She was not to discuss the family with the servants, or the servants with the family, or anything at all with anybody in the village. She would take her meals in the schoolroom. His Grace she would very likely not see, and if she did see him she would not speak, unless she was spoken to, and she would not be spoken to. And then Mrs. Yardley stopped on the half landing, with her hand on the rail, and said the last of it in a different voice, lower, the way you repeat a thing that has been said to you until it has worn smooth. In this house, she said, we do not speak of her late ladyship. Verity waited for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. Mrs. Yardley went on up the stairs. That first evening, before the light was quite gone, she stood at the window of her cold room and looked down into the yard, and she saw the thing the house was built around, though she did not yet know that was what she was seeing. A groom brought a horse out of the far range on a long rein, holding it at arm's length, at the very end of the leather, the way you carry something you are afraid of. It was a gray, a big one, iron dark down the legs and dappled silver over the quarters and near enough white about the head, and it came out of the dark of the arch into the last of the light like something coming up out of deep water, and it was the most beautiful animal she had ever seen, and one of the unhappiest. It did not fight the man. That was the thing that went into her like a splinter and stayed. She had thought, from the sound, that it would fight. It did not. It walked out into the middle of the empty yard where the man let it stand, and it lifted its head, and it looked once at the shut west wing of the house, at a particular window on the first floor where the shutters were closed, and then it turned itself, without a signal from the man, without a touch, and it walked to the far corner of the yard where a low wall ran along under the arch to the paddock, and it stood at the wall with its chest almost against the stone and its head down over the top of it looking at nothing, at the empty paddock beyond, and it stayed there. The groom did not pull it away. He stood at the end of the rein and let it stand, and took his hat off and wiped his face, and Verity understood, watching from 2 floors up in the freezing dark, that the man had done this a great many times, and that it broke his heart every time, and that he had stopped being able to do anything about that. The horse stood at the wall until it was full dark. Then it let itself be let in, and up in the north room Verity Prouse sat down on the edge of the hard bed, with her father's coat still round her shoulders, and thought about the last morning she had had a father, when she had gone out to his stable before it was light, and stood in front of the empty stall where his old cob had been, and knocked on the manger post with her knuckle 3 times, and told it, because he had made her promise she would, in the same flat voice he used for reckoning up a bill, that a horse should be told when its master dies, or it will look for him at the gate till its heart gives out. She had felt like a fool. She had done it anyway. She had told the cob, and the shelf of bottles, and the cold forge, and the yard, one after another, the master is dead, and you are to be sold to good people, and you are not to wait for him. And now she sat in a rich man's freezing house and listened 2 floors below her, to a horse that nobody had told anything, walking and turning and walking in the dark. The child was called Nan, and she was 6 years old, and she had not said a word aloud since the winter her mother died. Verity was given her at 8 the next morning, in a schoolroom at the top of the house, with a good fire and a globe and a great many maps, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the smallest, stillest child she had ever seen. A little girl with her mother's dark hair plaited tight, and her mother's gray eyes gone flat and careful, sitting very upright at a table with her hands folded on the wood, watching the door to see what had come in. "Mrs.," Yardley said, "she can hear you perfectly well. There is nothing wrong with her ears. She has simply chosen to be tiresome," and she said it in front of the child, over the child's head, the way people do when they have decided a child is a piece of furniture that happens to breathe. And Verity felt something turn over in her chest that she recognized, because it was the same thing that had turned over in her at the wall the evening before, watching the horse. She did not try to make the child speak. She had grown up with a man who would sooner have been kicked across a yard than hurry a frightened thing, and she knew in her bones the one law that ran under all the others, which was that you do not go and get a creature that has gone away inside itself. You make the place safe, and you make yourself dull and steady, and you wait, and one day it comes back to the door on its own to see what you are doing, and that is the only way it is ever done. And it cannot be hurried by so much as an hour. So she read to the child, and drew maps with her, and taught her the counties and the rivers and the use of the globe, and asked her nothing she could not answer with a nod, and after 4 days the little girl had stopped watching the door. That was all. It was a great deal. She learned the shape of the house the way the furniture learns it, from underneath, and she saw the grief laid out through the rooms like a table set for a guest who is never coming. She saw the side saddle. It hung on a bracket in the harness room, a lady's saddle, and it was soaped and oiled, and the stirrup polished until it threw the light, and a groom took it down every so often and worked the leather and hung it back. And nobody rode it, and nobody ever would, because the woman it had been cut and stuffed and balanced for was under a stone in the churchyard. She saw the habit. There was a door on the first floor landing that stood a little ajar, and behind it, on a peg, hung a lady's riding habit of dark green cloth, with a long skirt, brushed with a little curl of veiling pinned to the hat on the shelf above it, ready, as if its owner had gone down to the yard for a moment and would be back to put it on. And she saw, on the second morning, the worst of it, the one that stayed with her longest, because it was the smallest. There was a mounting block in the stable yard, 3 worn stone steps by the arch, and on the top step, side by side, stood a pair of ladies' riding boots, small ones, the leather cleaned and fed and the tops turned down, and a boy came out at 7:30 with a box under his arm and took the boots and cleaned them where they stood and set them back exactly square. And Verity watched him do it from the passage window and understood that he had done it every morning for 2 winters, that a pair of boots had been cleaned and set out at the foot of a mounting block 600 mornings for a woman who was never going to come down and put her foot in the stirrup again, and that not one soul in that house had been able to say the sentence that would let them stop. The horse she was forbidden. She kept away from the far range for 11 days, which was as long as she could manage, and she kept away by an act of will, because the sound of him came up through the floor of the house at night and lay on her chest, and in the daytime, from the schoolroom window, she could see the corner of the paddock where he stood at the wall, a gray shape with its head down, in the frost, in the rain, in the thin January sun, for 2 and 3 hours at a stretch, and she could see that the wall he stood at was a particular wall, and that he stood at a particular part of it, and she began, without wanting to do her father's arithmetic. She learned the man before she went to the horse. His name was Elias Ganton, and he was the head groom, 70 years old, bent like a hoop, with hands like the burl of an oak and a white beard that lay on his chest. And he had been at Aldermore since he was 9, and had put the present Duke on his first pony. And he was the only man on the place the Grey did not try to kill. She found him in the harness room one wet afternoon, and stood in the door and watched him soap the dead woman's saddle. And then she said, not asking about the horse, asking about the leather, whose saddle it was. Ganton's hands stopped in the wax. He looked at the door. He looked at her, at the smallness of her and the plainness of her and the man's coat she wore against the cold, and something in his face decided to take a risk it had not taken in 2 years. And he told her, in a voice pitched under the sound of the rain on the shingles, the second law of that estate, the one that lay under the first law, the one she had not been told because you do not tell the Newell post the history of the house. Her ladyship was the Duke's sister, Lady Cecily, and she had been 20 years old, and she had been the finest natural horsewoman he had seen in 60 years in a stable, better than her brother, better than her father, able to sit anything on 4 legs and make it think the whole business had been its own idea. The Grey was hers. She had bought him herself at 3 years old off a Yorkshire dealer against everybody's advice. A big, raw, savage-tempered grey colt that had already thrown 2 men and been marked down as a rogue, and she had made him, alone over a winter, into the best hunter in the Vale. And there was not a fence between there, and the sea the two of them had not taken. And to see her come across the park on that horse, Ganton said, was to see one creature, not 2. And I am an old man, and I have not the words for it. But I have not seen its like, and I shall not see it again. And then 2 winters ago, in the black frost after Christmas, on a night I will carry to my grave, Ganton said, and stopped, and looked at the door again, and his old hands began to shake in the wax, and he did not tell her the rest of it that day. He told her only the end of it. He told her that the horse had come home alone in the dark, lame and cut and wet through, and screaming in a way he had never heard a horse scream, and that they had found her ladyship at first light against the park wall by the sunken lane, and that she had been 3 hours dead in the frost, and that the horse had stood over her the whole of that night, and would not let the men near her when they came, and had been half a rogue and half a heartbreak ever since, and would let no one touch him but a 70-year-old man, and stood every day at the wall of the near paddock, because it was the nearest he could get to the other wall. The real wall, the one out on the sunken lane where it had happened, which he could not reach, and which nobody, Ganton said, nobody in this house nor out of it, had ever once had the courage to speak of in the 2 years since, and they had not told him. That was the thing that stood Verity's hair on end when she understood it, standing in a harness room with the rain coming down. Nobody had told the horse. There is an old way in the country, older than the church, of leading a dead man's horse at his burying, riderless, with the empty boots set backward in the stirrups, so the beast may walk behind its master to the grave and see him put down and know. And it is done for a plain farmer, and it is done with great ceremony for a great man. And it had not been done for Lady Cecily, because at her burying her brother the Duke had come out of the house white as a sheet, and had given an order in a voice nobody dared cross, that the Grey was not to be brought, that the Grey was not to be spoken of, that the Grey was not to be seen, and so the horse had stood in his box a quarter of a mile off and heard the bell toll, and had not been allowed to walk behind her, and had spent 2 years since walking behind her anyway, on his own, at a wall, turn and turn about, 4 steps and a turn, because nobody had ever let him see, and nobody had ever told him. And a horse that is not told will look for its rider at the gate until its heart gives out or its mind does, and this one's mind was going. And that was the whole of what was wrong with him. And there was not a man on that estate who could see it, because they were all of them standing inside the same silence, stepping over the same hole. She went to him on the 12th night. She could not help it any longer. She waited until the house was down and the yard was quiet, and she went out in her father's coat with a horn lantern turned low. And she did not go into the box, because she was not a fool, but she went and stood at the door of it in the dark, on the outside, with the lantern set on the ground where it would not throw on him. And she did what her father had taught her to do with a thing that has gone dangerous, which is to say, she did nothing at all, for a very long time. She did not speak. She did not click, or cluck, or coax. She stood with her shoulder against the wall and her eyes turned a little away, because a thing that is afraid reads a straight look as a threat, and she breathed slow and long and let him hear her breathing, and she waited. Inside, the walking stopped. That was the first thing. The 4 steps and the turn stopped, and there was a long stillness, and then she heard him come to the door. 1 slow step and another, and she felt more than saw the great head come over the half-door above her, and she felt his breath move the hair at her temple. 1 long, suspicious pull of air as he took the whole of her in, the horse doctor's daughter, the man's coat, the smell of the schoolroom and the cold, and she stood and let herself be smelled and did not move a muscle and did not turn her head. And after a while, over her, in the dark, she heard the great animal let out a breath, a long, uneven, shuddering sigh of a breath, the breath of a creature setting down for 1 moment a weight it has carried alone too long. And she shut her eyes and stood there in the cold, with her father's whole life going through her at once. She went every night after that, at the hour when nobody wanted her, and stood at his door in the dark, and gave him nothing but a steady, dull, safe presence, and the sound of a person breathing who did not want a single thing from him. And by the middle of February she had the door open and her flat hand on the great gray shoulder, on the exact place her father had shown her when she was 9, the place where you may feel the whole engine of the animal running under your palm. And she felt the turn and the tread and the endless 4 steps go still under her hand, and she did for that horse the only useful thing she knew, which nobody had thought to do in 2 years, which was to be with him and ask him for nothing. Elias Ganton found her at it on the 20th of February at 6 in the morning, standing inside the box in the dark with her forehead against the gray's neck. And the old man stood in the passage with his lantern and did not say a word for a long time. And then he said, in a voice that had something broken loose in it, "I have been feared of that horse for 2 years, miss, and I have loved him for 10, and I could not do both at once, and you have gone and done the one I couldn't." She said, "He is not mad. He is grieving. And there is a difference. And everybody in this house knows the difference in a person, and not one of you will see it in a horse." Ganton looked at her, and looked at the gray, who had turned his head and was resting the whole weight of it, 20 pounds of bone, along the top of her shoulder with his eyes half shut, and the old man took his hat off, which she never once saw him do for a living soul in all the months she knew him, and he said, "No, no, he is not mad. God forgive us all." But it was too late for the seeing to save him, because the order had already gone out. The gray had broken a stable lad's arm in January, before ever Verity touched him, flinging his head in the dark when the boy came at him wrong with a light, and the boy's father was a tenant, and had made a noise, and the estate was managed in those years not by the Duke, who signed what was put before him and rode out at 7 and came back at 2 and spoke to nobody, but by a board of trustees in the Duke's cousin's interest, careful, anxious men in a town 12 miles off who had never seen the horse and did not need to. And the trustees had written to the master of horse that a dangerous animal that had already maimed one servant and killed, as they wrote it, one member of the family, was not to be maintained at the estate's charge and risk any longer, and was to be humanely destroyed at the spring term, on Lady Day, the 25th of March, and the master of horse, Mr. Corbin Rook, who did not want to do it, and had no ground to refuse it, had set the day. So that is how Verity Prowse came to be standing with her back against a stable door at first light on the 25th of March with her arms out along the wood and 2 men and a coil of rope in front of her. And that is what Mr. Rook meant when he said the order comes from higher than me. And when she had said no, and said it flat, and the horse behind the door had gone quiet at the sound of her, Rook stood in the cold yard with the guns and looked at her for a long moment. And he was not a cruel man, and this was the last thing on God's earth he wanted to do before breakfast. And he said the honest thing, which was, "I do not know that one word you say is true, miss, and you are 23, and you teach the child her globes, and I have a letter from 4 sober gentlemen in Marlbrook with the law behind it." And she said, "I have had my hand on that horse's heart every morning for a month, and he has never once offered me the least harm. And I will show you. And you may stand there with the gun if you like. And if he so much as lays back an ear at me, you may fire it." And she turned her back on the 2 men and the rope and the guns, which is a thing you must understand took more than they will ever any of them have known. And she opened the door of the box of a horse that had maimed a man and stood over a dead woman all night. And she went in to him in the gray light, with 30 men, it seemed, watching, though it was only 4. And the gray came off the back wall to her with his head down and put his face into the front of her coat. And she stood in the doorway with her hand flat on his cheek in full view of all of them. And there was not a sound in that yard but the pigeons. Rook lowered the gun. That is why he was never the villain of this, and never became one. He lowered the gun, and he looked at that horse standing quiet with its muzzle in a girl's coat, the horse he had been sent to shoot. And he was a horseman himself under the master's coat, and he knew, everyone in that yard knew, that you do not see that from a rogue. And he said, at last, Well, this alters nothing that is on the paper, miss, and I cannot unwrite 4 gentlemen's order on the strength of one morning." And Verity, who had lain awake the whole of the night before working out exactly what she would say if she got as far as this, and he did not simply have her taken away, said, "Then give me the summer." She said, "The paper says, the horse is dangerous and worth nothing, and a charge on the estate. Give me until the memorial, until the day they set her ladyship's stone. And if by that day I have not brought him to stand quiet and be handled and be ridden and be safe about the child and the yard and every man in it, if I have not made him worth keeping in weight and in use and in plain sense, then you may bring the guns back, and I will open the door for you myself. And I will never say one word against it as long as I live." Rook chewed on that. The memorial was fixed for the 24th of July. The late lady's headstone had been cut a year and more, and stood the whole time in the mason's yard, because the Duke had never been able to have it set, until the trustees and the rector had at last named a day and taken the thing out of his hands. And it hung over the house that spring like a second death coming. 4 months, Rook said. "And where did you learn horses, miss?" that I should stake 4 gentlemen's order and my own place on your summer. And she said, My father was Gideon Prouse of the Vale of Marlbrook, and he mended horses for 30 years that other men had given up to the knacker. And there is not a hunt, nor a coaching yard, nor a farm within 40 miles of where I was born that he did not save some beast for. And you may drive over any market day and say his name, and they will keep you standing in the road an hour telling you what he could do. And he is under a stone I paid for by selling my mother's cross, and I am the only thing he left behind him that carries any of it. Rook was quiet. Then he said, My father bought a mare off a Gideon Prouse at Marlbrook Fair the year I was born, and kept her 22 years, and would never hear a word against the man. Verity said nothing. She had not known it. It was simply true, the way half the Vale was true if you stood in it long enough. Rook put the letter back inside his coat. The bargain was made standing up in the cold yard, and it was made the way the whole of that estate did its business, which is to say it was written down, because Corbin Rook had never in his life shaken a hand on a thing he had not first set down in ink. She would have the gray. She would have Elias Ganton 2 hours a day, and the run of the far range, and the near paddock, and whatever was in the feed store, and not 1 shilling besides, and no help from any other man in the yard, unless he offered it of his own will, which at the outset not one of them did. She would have until the 24th of July, and Rook wrote it in the yard book that evening in his round, careful hand. The horse called Aldermore Grey, condemned Lady Day, respited to the day of the memorial on the surety of the Governess. And he read it back to her standing at the corn bin with the lantern between them. And at the end of it he said, And I will tell you plainly, Miss, I have written a great many things in this book in 30 years, and never one I expected less to come to good. And I hope to God you make a liar of me, and I have not hoped that of anything in a long while. And then he did the first kind thing anybody at Aldermore had done for her, which she did not understand, until much later he told the 2 men with the guns, in the hearing of the yard, that it had been too raw and hard a morning to do the business properly, and that it would keep, and he sent them off. And by that small lie he let her win it later, without him having lost it in front of his own men that day. She met the Duke properly on the 2nd of April, at dusk, at the paddock rail. She had the gray out on a long rein in the near paddock in the last of the light, walking him, only walking him, letting him move under the open sky with a person at the end of the leather who wished him no harm, and she was talking to him, which is a thing horse people do and cannot explain to anybody who is not one. A low-running nonsense of words that means nothing and carries everything, and she looked up, and there was a man standing at the rail with his hands on the top bar, watching her, and she knew him at once though she had never seen him near, because the whole yard had arranged itself around his absence for 11 weeks, and here the absence was, wearing a coat. He was tall, a good deal over 6 foot, and lean to the point of gauntness, with dark hair worn too long, and pushed back off a hard, handsome, unhappy face. And he looked at the horse the way you look at a room where a person you loved used to sit. She should have stopped, and dropped the rein short, and curtsied, and taken the gray away, because that is what the newel post does when the master of the house appears. Instead, she was tired, and 11 weeks into a thing that was going to break her heart or make it, and she had the gray going soft and low and swinging along at the end of the leather at last, and she was not going to snatch him up and stiffen him and undo an hour's work for the sake of a curtsy, and so she said, without thinking, in the flat, plain voice, "Keep your hands still on the rail, sir, if you please, and do not speak yet." The Duke of Aldermore, who had not been told what to do by any living creature since he was 19 years old, who was addressed by his own household in the passive voice, who had been handled for 2 years by every soul in his life as if he were a cracked glass being carried across a crowded room, kept his hand still on the rail, and did not speak. The gray had felt him at the rail before Verity ever saw him, and had gone up like a wire, head flung, the old walking start coming back into his feet, because the man at the rail was part of the black frost and the toll of the bell and the worst night of his life. And Verity brought the horse round in a slow wide arc away from the rail and down the far side and back, talking. The low nonsense, until the gray came off the boil and dropped his head and blew, and only then, with the horse settled, did she let him drift up the paddock toward the rail again, toward the man, on his own feet, at his own pace, choosing it. And she let the rein run long through her fingers, and gave the horse the whole length of it, and did not pull him 1 inch either way. And the gray walked up to the rail where the Duke of Aldermore stood with his hands gone white on the top bar, and stopped a yard off and put his head out, and smelled the man's hair, the way he had smelled Verity's the first night, one long, unwilling pull of air, and the Duke stood absolutely still with his jaw set like a man taking a wound, and the horse breathed him in. The brother, the frost, the bell, the 2 years, all of it. And then the great gray head came the last foot and rested, very heavily and very gently, along the side of the Duke's face, and stayed there. Nobody in that paddock moved. The man stood with a 17-hand horse's cheek laid against his own, and his hands locked on the rail and his eyes shut, and after a long time Verity saw his shoulders go, once. A single deep helpless movement, and she looked away, because there are things a person is owed, and one of them is not to be watched while it happens. He did not weep, quite. It was worse than weeping and quieter. When it was over he stood back from the rail, and the gray lifted his head, and the Duke looked at Verity across the horse with an expression she could not read at all, and he said, in a low voice with 2 years of rust all over it, the first words she ever heard him speak, they told me he could not be handled. And she said, "They were mistaken, sir. He is only heartbroken, and there is a great deal of him, so there is a great deal of it. But it is not madness, and it is not danger. It is grief, and grief will answer to patience where it will answer to nothing else on earth." The Duke looked at the horse for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "And where did you learn that it was grief?" And Verity said, "At my father's knee, sir, in a stable, before I could read." And the Duke of Aldermore said, "Then your father knew more than my physician." And he turned and walked back up to the dark house and did not say good night, and that was the first time. He came again, not every evening, but often, at dusk, when she had the gray out, and he would stand at the rail with his hands on the bar and watch, and sometimes he said nothing at all for an hour and then went in. And sometimes he asked her a plain question about the horse, and she answered it plainly. And piece by piece, in that way, over the weeks of April and into May, the man began to talk. Not about it, around it. He told her the gray had been foaled the same spring his sister came out, and that the two of them had grown up wild together, and that his sister had been the only person in the family who was not afraid of anything, and that he had spent his whole boyhood being the careful one, the one who held the gate and counted the risks and said perhaps we had better not, while she went first at everything and laughed at him for minding. He told her the roof of the west wing had wanted doing since the year 8, and that he had not been able to make himself send a man up onto it because the west wing was hers. He told her, one evening at the very end of April, with the light going green over the wood, that he had not slept a whole night through since the winter she died, and then looked as though he wished he could reach out and pull the words back out of the air. And Verity said, "My father used to say that a man who cannot sleep is only somebody standing outside a door in the cold, waiting to be let in." And the Duke said, "That is not a comfortable thought." And she said, "No, sir, but it is a door, and doors open." And he was silent for a long while, and then he said, "I do not know how to open this one. I have not the way of it. I never had." And she did not answer that, and she did not reach for the latch of him with a lever, because you do not go and get a thing that has gone away inside itself. You make the place safe, and you wait. And she heard him laugh once in May, and it undid her more than anything he ever said. She had the gray on the long rein, and the horse had taken exception to a barrow left standing by the gate, and had gone up on his hind legs, not in temper, in sheer high spirits. The first real high spirits anyone had seen in him in 2 years. 1,200 pounds of gray horse standing straight up against the evening sky like something off a monument, and Verity, instead of hauling on him, had laughed up at him and said, "Oh, very grand. Come down, nobody is impressed." And the gray had come down and shaken himself and looked sheepish. And from the rail, in the dusk, she heard the Duke of Aldermore laugh out loud, a short, cracked, disused sound, gone almost before it was out, and she saw his own hand go up to his mouth as if to catch it, as if he had done something wrong, as if a man were not allowed, and she did not look at him and did not remark on it and let it be. But she carried it up to her cold room that night and lay awake holding it, because she had begun, by then, to be in a danger she had not the standing in the world to survive, and she knew it, and she went on standing in it anyway. The child came to the horse before the child came back to her voice, and it happened the way her father had always said it would, sideways, when nobody was reaching. Little Nan had taken to following Verity down to the yard in the safe hour, silent, holding a fold of her skirt, and standing well back by the corn bin while Verity worked the gray, watching with her flat, careful eyes, and Verity never once said, "Come and see the horse," or "Would you like to stroke him?" because she knew that the surest way to send the child a mile back inside herself was to want something of her. She simply let the child stand there, day on day, ignored and safe. And one evening at the beginning of May she became aware, without turning her head, that the small figure by the corn bin was no longer by the corn bin. And she went on grooming and said nothing, and out of the side of her eye she watched a very small girl cross 10 feet of open cobble, one silent step at a time, and come to a stop, right under the enormous gray horse, under the great belly and the huge quiet legs, in the one place in that yard where a stranger would have snatched her back screaming, and reach up and lay her hand flat on the gray's foreleg, on the running engine place, though nobody had shown her, because she was her mother's daughter. And the gray turned his head down and breathed on the child's dark hair and stood over her like a roof, and did not move so much as a hoof, this horse that had broken a grown man's arm. And Verity stood 2 feet away with her heart going like a hammer and said, in the same idle nonsense voice she used on the horse, so the child would not know she had been seen, "Well, now," and went on grooming and did not spoil it, and it was the hardest thing she did in all those months, harder than facing the guns, to stand there and not make it a thing, and only let it be true. Lady Helena Vaux came down from town on the 9th of May, with a maid, a man, 16 boxes, and a way of entering a room that made the room settle itself and stand up straight. She was 26, and she was, past any argument, beautiful, with dark gold hair and a clear gray level gaze and a white throat, and that particular carriage that cannot be got after the age of 12, and Verity learned within a day that she was not a guest, and not a stranger, and not a visitor. She had her own rooms. She had had them for years, because Lady Helena Vaux and the Duke of Aldermore had been spoken of together since they were children, their two estates marching along 4 miles of the same river, and it had been understood in both houses and in every drawing room in the county for the better part of a decade that they would marry, and would have married already, most people thought, if the black frost after Christmas 2 years since had not put the whole house into a mourning it had never come out of. She had waited. She had been, by every account and by her own quiet reckoning, patient and loyal, and very good, through 2 years in which the man she was to marry had gone silent and gray and unreachable, and she had come down every spring and stayed near him and asked nothing and mentioned nothing on a long list of things one did not mention, frost and walls and the sunken lane and her name and the gray horse, and she had learned to walk through that house as carefully as everybody else, and she had earned. She felt, and not without justice, the thing that was coming to her, which was to be the Duchess of Aldermore by the year's end. And she came down that May and found a horse doctor's daughter at the bottom of the paddock telling the Duke to keep his hands still on the rail, and the Duke keeping them still, and the gray horse that no one could go near standing with its head along the man's face, and the whole terrible frozen machine of that house beginning, after 2 years, to move, and it had not been she who moved it. Lady Helena was kind to Verity. That must be set down plainly, before the rest of it, because she was not a monster, and it would be a lie to make her one, and the truth of this is worse than a monster would have been. She learned Verity's name in a day, which was more than Mrs. Yardley had troubled to do in 4 months. She saw the child follow the governess down to the yard, and she was glad of it, honestly glad, because she loved the child in her way, and had grieved over the little silent creature as much as anyone. She gave Verity a length of good gray stuff in June to have made up against the summer, because she saw her going threadbare, and Verity kept the memory of that kindness for the rest of her life, and never afterward knew what to do with it. And she was clever, Lady Helena, and she was not blind, and she had loved the Duke a long time, and it took her about a fortnight to understand exactly what she was looking at down at the paddock rail in the green evenings, and to understand that it had happened to the man without his knowing it, and to the girl without her wanting it, and that neither of them had done a single thing that a court or a bishop could name, and that this, precisely this, was what made it not to be born. Because there is no fighting it. A woman may fight a flirtation and win. She cannot fight a horse doctor's daughter standing in the dusk telling a broken man that his grief is only grief and will answer to patience, while the man listens as if water were being given him in a desert. There is nothing to take hold of. And Lady Helena Vaux, who had done everything right for 10 years and was owed her reward by every rule she had been raised inside, watched a girl in a dead man's coat undo 2 years of her careful waiting in 6 weeks by the simple means of not being afraid of him. And something in her that had been patient a very long time began, very quietly, to stop being patient. And there was one thing more, and it is the thing that turned her at the last, and it is only fair to her to say it, because without it she is a villain, and with it she is a person, which is worse. Lady Helena Vaux knew what had happened on the night of the Black Frost. She was one of perhaps 3 people alive who knew the whole of it, because she had been part of it. She had been Cecily's friend since girlhood, and in the last autumn of Cecily's life she had been the go-between, carrying the letters, because Cecily, at 20, had fallen in love with a man her brother would not hear of, a half-pay lieutenant with a scarred face and no fortune, and had meant to marry him, and the Duke had found it out. And there had been a quarrel 2 nights after Christmas that the servants heard through 2 closed doors, and the Duke had gone out and given the order to chain the great gates and lock the stable, to keep her in. And Lady Helena had carried the last letter of all, the one that said, "Tonight, the wall by the sunken lane at midnight, we will go to Scotland." And Cecily had saddled the grey herself in the dark, and found the gates chained, and put the horse at the 12-foot park wall in the black frost, and been thrown against the coping stones and killed 40 feet from the man she was running to. Lady Helena knew every word of it. She had carried the letter, and she had spent 2 years being very kind to the man whose sister she had, in her own night thoughts at 2 a.m, helped to kill, and there is no describing what that does to a person, and she had never once been able to tell him, because to tell him was to end herself, and so she had folded it down small and sat on it and waited to be his wife, and it was into that woman, wound tight as a watch spring, for 2 years over a secret that could destroy her, that the sight of Verity Prowse and the grey horse and the Duke at the rail dropped like a coal. She did not decide to do a wicked thing. Nobody in this ever does. What happens is that a clever, frightened person who has been holding a terrible thing very still for a very long time is shown a door out, and the door is made entirely of true pieces, and she does not have to invent one single thing. She has only to take up the true pieces that are lying about and hold them up in a particular order. She came down to the paddock herself on the 20th of June, in the evening, in good shoes over the rough grass, which for a woman like her is a labor of will, and she stood at the rail at a careful distance and said Verity's name, and then said the thing she had come to say. And she said it well, because she was neither stupid nor yet, at that moment, cruel. There is a family, she said, in Bath. Very good people. A physician and his wife, 3 children, and they want a governess who is steady and does not chatter, and it is £30 a year, and your own parlour, and a fire and a half day on Sundays, and I have written to them, and they will take you on my word, and you may go at the quarter and be settled before the winter. £30 a year. Verity stood at the rail with the Grey's rope in her hand, and did the sum that any woman in her place does at once and cannot help doing. £30 a year was nearly 4 times her keep, and £8 at Aldermore. It was a parlour of her own with a fire in it. It was, for a girl with 4 shillings and no aunt and a dead man's coat, the whole difference between a life and a long string of other people's cold back stairs, and it was, she knew perfectly well, standing there, also a bribe, and the most generous bribe she was ever likely in her life to be offered. She said, "May I ask why your ladyship is so good to me?" And Lady Helena, to her lasting credit, did not pretend. She looked at the grey horse, and she looked at the girl, and she said, "Because I am going to marry him at Christmas, and I have carried this house on my back for 2 years, every day of it, and I am not going to be turned out of it in June by a governess in a man's coat who came here in January on a carrier's cart." Verity said, "He has not asked me for anything, my lady." And Lady Helena said, "No, he has not. He does not ask anybody for anything. He has not asked a living soul for one thing since the frost. He stands at gates and waits for other people to open them. It is the whole of his character. And if we all wait for that man to speak, we shall every one of us be dead and buried first. Somebody has to live his life for him. I have been doing it 2 years. You have been here 5 months. And she was, in every particular she named, entirely correct, and Verity knew it, and could not for the life of her hate her. She said, "My lady, I have a bargain with Mr. Rook that falls due on the 24th of July, and if I leave before then he shoots the gray. And I will not do that. I cannot do that. And it is nothing to do with his grace. It is to do with the horse. And I gave my word. And Lady Helena looked at her for a long, level moment and said, quietly, and without any plan yet in her head, only the first cold shape of one beginning to form, that is not the whole of why you are staying, and we both know it. And she picked her way back up over the rough grass in her ruined shoes, and Verity watched her go, and had a feeling like a cloud crossing the sun and no notion at all what to do with it. The man from Loughton came on the 2nd of July. His name was Mr. Josiah Kell, and he was a horse breeder from the far side of the county with a great square honest face and a coat that smelled of the stable, and he had come 33 miles on the strength of a letter Verity had written him in June, and paid the postage on out of the £6 that was all she had in the world, because she had understood, back in the spring, that winning her bargain was not enough, that to prove the gray worth keeping in weight and in shillings, written in Rook's book, she needed more than a quiet horse, she needed a figure at the foot of a column, and there was only one thing a horse like that could be made to earn. The gray was a made hunter of the finest blood in the Vale, sound now, gentle now, and Mr. Kell wanted him for a stud season. He had 6 good mares and a waiting list with more, and he offered 8 guineas a mare and a 3-year standing arrangement, and put £5 down on the top bar of the gate in a little wash leather bag as earnest, and said in his broad flat voice that in 3 years that Gray would have earned back 10 times whatever it cost to keep him. £5 in earnest money, and a contract worth 40 a year, for a horse that was under sentence of death as a worthless, dangerous charge on the estate. Verity did not tell a soul. That is the whole hinge of what followed, and it was not deceit. It was a girl of 23 who had one card in the world and wanted to lay it down at exactly the right hour and in front of exactly the right people. She had a bargain that fell due on the 24th of July, at the memorial, with the whole Vale looking on, and she wanted to walk up to Corbin Rook on that day in front of everybody with the horse standing quiet and a Loughton contract in her hand and a bag of earnest money on the book, and set the whole of it down at once, the horse saved and the horse earning and the horse worth more alive than any man had dared to dream, and to be, for one single hour of her life, looked at. So she put the £5 in the bottom of her box under her father's coat, and she walked Mr. Kell down the drive under the great beeches, and they shook hands at the tall iron gates between the 2 carved rearing horses. And Sir Gilbert Massey's carriage went by on the turnpike at that precise moment, and Sir Gilbert, who was a magistrate and a neighbor and a heavy, careful man much concerned with the good order of the county, looked out of his window and saw the Duke of Aldermore's governess shaking hands with a rough-coated stranger at the gates, and thought nothing whatever of it, and mentioned it that evening to Lady Helena Vaux over tea at his own table, as a piece of the day's nothing, because a man will always tell a beautiful woman the small doings of the road. It took Lady Helena about 4 seconds. She had been 3 weeks by then wound tighter and tighter, watching the thing at the paddock ripen, and she had the cold shape of it already half built in her mind, waiting only for a nail to hang it on, and here was the nail. A stranger at the gate, money passing, a penniless girl who had come in January with nothing, and who had, everyone would shortly find, £5 hid in her box. And a story worth real money to the right buyer, because there was one. There was always one. The whole county had been chewing the edge of it for 2 years. That the 2 of them, the Duke and his sister, had quarreled the week she died, that the great gates had been found chained on the morning they carried her in, that a broken lieutenant had been beaten half to death in the sunken lane by grooms who took him for a poacher and had vanished before dawn, and there were men in London, everyone knew it, who would pay 50 guineas for a paragraph that said a duke had chained his own gates against his own sister and driven her onto the wall that killed her. Lady Helena Vaux, who knew that every word of that was true, put down her teacup. She did not go to the Duke. She went to Sir Gilbert Massey 3 days later, and she sat in his wife's drawing room and was very distressed, and said she had not slept for the trouble of it, and did not know where her duty lay. And then she said that she must tell him, because she could not carry it alone, that the governess had confessed it to her in the garden weeks ago, with a strange calm, that his grace had chained the gates that night on purpose to keep her ladyship in, and had as good as put her on the wall, and that the girl had said there was money in the story, real money, from a gentleman in the print way, and that a man had come from away about it, and had she, Sir Gilbert, not himself seen the fellow at the gates. And Sir Gilbert Massey said, "God bless me, madam, I did with these eyes on Thursday last." And there it was. Every stone of it was true but the one that was not. And the one that was not was buried in the middle where no one would think to dig, and the whole structure stood up perfect and terrible on its true foundations. And it was in the Aldermore Arms by the Tuesday, and in Marlbrook Market by the Thursday, and it went through that vale in 9 days like fire through a rick. And it grew as it ran, until there was a version in which she had been paid 40 guineas, and a version in which she had come to Aldermore a spy. And the thing Verity did not understand until much later is that they wanted it, not because they were wicked, but because for 2 years the whole vale had stood in a careful circle around a hole in the middle of a sentence, being tactful, saying the accident. And here at last was a thing it was permitted to be angry about. And the relief of it ran through the county like weather. The village turned on the 17th. A boy threw a stone and starred the window of the harness room. Somebody left the near paddock gate swinging wide in the night, hoping, she thought, that the mad grey would get out and do a mischief and settle the matter. But the grey only walked out into the lane and stood at the wall, at his wall, and was there in the morning where Gantone found him and led him in weeping. On the 19th she went into Marlbrook for a farrier's rasp, and a woman she had never spoken to in her life stepped square in front of her on the pavement and said, "You should be ashamed of yourself," and spat on the stones beside her shoe, and a dozen people stopped to watch, and not one of them was sorry. She went home and told nobody. She was called up on the 21st of July, 3 days before the memorial. It was the small drawing room, and Mrs. Yardley was there, and Corbin Rook was there with his hat in his 2 hands and his eyes on the carpet, and Lady Helena Vaux sat in the chair by the cold hearth, and the Duke of Aldermore stood at the window with his back to the whole room. Nobody asked Verity to sit. Lady Helena said it beautifully. She was gentle, and she was grieved, and she was so very sorry, she said. And she repeated what she had heard in the garden, the confession, the money, the man from away, in a low voice with tears standing in her clear gray eyes, and she was believed, because she believed the shape of it herself, which is the way the very best lies are always told. And then she said, "And the man at the gates, and the £5, and every head in that room turned to Verity Prouse." Verity said, "His name is Josiah Kell, and he is a horse breeder from Loughton, and he came about a stud season for the grey, and the paper is a stud contract worth £40 a year to this estate, and I did not tell anyone, because I meant to lay it on the book at the memorial and be looked at, for once, and that is the whole of my crime. And it is vanity, and I own it." "Mrs." Yardley said, and the 5 pounds hid in her box. Because Mrs. Yardley had been sent to turn out the governess's box that morning and had found 5 pounds in a wash leather bag under a dead man's coat. And 5 pounds in the box of a girl who had come to Aldermore with 4 shillings is a thing there is no innocent account of, unless you happen to hold the whole of it, which was earnest money on a horse contract not to be spoken of until the 24th. She said all of it plainly, and watched it land in that room and be too slow and have too many parts. That is what she learned in the small drawing room and never forgot. The truth is slow, and it comes in pieces, and you have to stand and wait while a person fits them together. A lie is one piece, and it is already the shape of a nail, and it goes in at a blow. She turned to the window, to the man straight back, and she said, "Sir, I have never in 6 months said one word about your sister to any living soul, and I never would. And you know it. You of all the world know it." And the Duke of Aldermore, who had heard every syllable, who knew in the one place where a man keeps the things he is sure of that this girl had never sold him and never could, who had exactly one thing to do in the whole of that afternoon, which was to turn round and open his mouth, did not turn round. Because to clear her he would have to say it. He would have to stand in that room and put the words in an order: the quarrel, the gates, the chain, the wall, and the moment any of it was said aloud, even the innocent half, the county would have its confirmation, and the lie would be proven true in its particulars in the very act of his defending her. If he spoke, he hanged himself and his sister's name together. If he stayed as he was, he lost the girl. And a man who has not said a true thing aloud in 2 years does not, at the one moment it would cost him everything, suddenly become a man who can. He stood at that window with his hands locked behind his back and the summer light on the glass, and he said nothing at all, and Mrs. Yardley told her she would leave in the morning. Now, if you want to know how a girl got out of that, and how a man who had not said one true word in 2 years came at the last to stand up in a churchyard in front of his whole county and say the very worst one, stay with me, because I am not near done with these people. And if this house has got its hand on you the way it had its hand on me while I was writing it, put your name to the channel before you go on, because there is more of Aldermore than one evening will hold. She was down at the Gray's box at 4:30 in the morning, in the dark, because there was a feed and a dressing to do on a cut foot, and she was not going to leave a horse the worse for what people said about her. Elias Ganton came and found her there at 5 and did not speak either, and the two of them worked side by side in the dark by one lantern until it came light. And when it was done, the old man stood with his hand on the Gray's neck and said the only thing he ever said to her about any of it. He said, "I have known since the morning we carried her in, miss. I chained those gates myself, on his order, with my own 2 hands, and I have never told a soul. And if I had gone into that drawing room yesterday and said it, they would have had to believe me, for I am the one that turned the key. And I did not. I sat in my harness room and let them put you out, because I have been feared of that man's grief for 2 years, the way you are feared of a live wire, and there is no better word for it than that, and I am 70 years old and ashamed to the bone." She said it was not yours to tell. He said no, but it wanted telling, and I knew it wanted telling, and I held my tongue, same as the rest, same as him. She left at 8 in the morning on the 22nd of July. Mrs. Yardley gave her a shilling that was not owed her, and did not meet her eye. Her box went down the front steps because there was no one to carry it round to the yard, and she stood in the drive under the great beeches with the box at her feet, in exactly the spot the carrier had set her down in January waiting for the same carrier to take her away, and she was 23, and had 6 shillings, and a dead man's coat, and a book about horses, and 5 pounds of earnest money she could not now bring herself to keep. And she had, in the plainest possible reckoning, gone all the way round the world in half a year, and fetched up precisely where she started, only more alone, because in January she had not yet had anything to lose. She did not go far. The sexton's widow at Aldermore Parva took her in for 9 pence, a week 2 miles down the vale, and she sat in that churchyard among strangers' stones for 2 days, and could not think of one single thing to do next. And on the 3rd day, which was the 24th of July, the day of the memorial, she got up and put on her father's coat and walked the 2 miles back. Not to the house, she would not have dared the house, but to the church, because the whole county was going, and one more plain woman at the back of a crowd is nobody, and because she could not keep away from the end of it any more than she had been able to keep away from the horse. The little church at the foot of Aldermore Park was full to the doors by 10:30, and they were standing 3 deep in the churchyard among the graves, because the whole vale had come to see the Duke set his sister's stone at last, and to see if they were honest, whether the disgraced governess would have the face to show. And Verity stood at the very back, against the wall by the light gate, in the crowd, in the coat, and waited. The stone stood veiled under a white cloth by the open family plot. The rector, a mild, frightened, decent man named Mr. Peck, got as far as the 2nd lesson. And then Sir Gilbert Massey rose from his place, because he was a churchwarden of 40 years and a magistrate, and he believed, wholly and honestly, that he was doing his plain duty, and he had carried the thing 3 weeks, and could not carry it through a memorial service 1 hour more. He said, "Forgive me," and he said it to the rector, and then he said it to the whole packed churchyard in a clear country voice, that he could not stand at the setting of that poor lady's stone with a clear conscience while there was among them, and he had seen her come in, the young woman who had sold the story that his grace had chained his own gates against his own sister and driven her to her death, and had taken money for it from a man at those very gates, and had confessed the whole to Lady Helena Vaux with her own mouth. And 400 faces turned in the churchyard and found Verity Prouse against the wall. And it went very quiet, and the rector looked down the crowd at her, and he was almost begging, and he said, "Miss Prouse, will you answer it?" She came forward through the crowd because they made a lane for her, the way a crowd makes a lane, and she stood at the head of the grave by the veiled stone with 400 people at her back, and she did not deny it first, and that was the thing. Everyone was braced for the noise of a girl crying no, and she did not make it. She said, in the flat plain voice she had found in front of the guns in March, "The man at the gates is a horse breeder named Josiah Kell, and he paid me 5 pounds in earnest for a stud season on her ladyship's grey, and the contract is worth 40 pounds a year to this estate, and it is in Mr. Rook's own hand in the yard book, and any man may read it. And I told nobody because I wanted to lay it down today and be looked at once in my life, and that is my whole crime, and it is vanity, and I have owned it, and I own it again here." And then she said, and lifted her head and spoke to the whole churchyard. But as for the rest of it, I have never in 6 months heard his grace say one word about his sister, not one, nor has any soul in this parish. And that, and not I, is what is wrong here, and every one of us standing in this yard has helped to keep it wrong. We have cleaned a dead woman's boots at the mounting block for 2 years. We have hung her habit behind a door. We have kept a horse standing at a wall till his mind near went, and we have forbidden her name in the house she was born in, and we have called all of it respect. and it is not respect, it is fear. And grief that is forbidden does not lie down where you put it. It gets up in the night and goes and lives in something else. And if you want to see where the grief of this house has been living for 2 years, go up the hill and look at that horse, for he has been carrying every ounce of it that the rest of you would not. And that is when the Duke of Aldermore stood up. He rose from the family pew and came out through the church door into the light of the churchyard, and 400 people pulled back, and there was a sound in that crowd like a wave drawing off shingle. He was 32 years old, and he had not said a sentence of consequence to another living soul in 2 years, and when his voice came it was so low that the men at the back leaned in and held their breath to catch it. He said, "My sister's name was Cecily." He said it, and the churchyard flinched as if he had fired a gun. He said, "She was 20 years old, and she is not away, and she is not to be spoken round any longer. She is dead. She is here. She is in this ground. And I have not said her name aloud in 2 years, and I have not let one of you say it either. And I begin by asking the pardon of every servant in my house who has cleaned her boots and soaped her saddle and laid her memory out like a table set for a guest, because that was not my grief honoring her, that was my grief made into a law and set on your shoulders to carry." He stopped. Nobody breathed. He said, "Sir Gilbert asks whether I chained my gates against my sister. I did. That is the piece that is true, and I will not stand here and let this girl be broken for saying a true thing she never said. So I will say it myself, all of it, now. And then it is said, and it can never again be a thing held over anyone." He told them. He told them about the quarrel 2 nights after Christmas, and the things a brother says that a brother cannot unsay, that she would not disgrace the name, that he would see her locked in her rooms first. He told them about John Ashe, the half-pay lieutenant with the scarred face and no fortune, whom his sister had loved and meant to marry, and whom he had forbidden her, not because the man was a beggar, he said, though he had called him one, but because, and here his voice did at last go, because I was afraid. Because she went first at everything her whole life, and I went last, and held the gate, and counted the cost, and I could not bear that she was going to go first at this too, out of my reach, into a life I was too much of a coward to want for myself, and so I chained the gates, to keep her a child, to keep her mine, to keep her safe. And she saddled the gray in the dark with her own hands, and found my chain on the gates, and put him at the wall in the black frost rather than be kept. And the horse came down, and I killed her. Not the horse. Me, my chain, on my gates, on the one night in her life she needed them open. That is what is under this stone, and I have carried it 2 years with my mouth shut, and let it eat the house. And it stops today. And there was a silence in that churchyard of a kind the people standing in it were still describing to their grandchildren 50 years on. And then Lady Helena Vaux came forward out of the crowd, white to the lips, and stood up in front of 400 people who had known her since she was a girl, and said, "She never said it. Not one word of any of it. I carried the last letter myself that autumn from Cecily to Mr. Ashe. I was the go-between. I have known the whole of it, as long as you have, and I have said nothing for 2 years, because to speak was to be ruined, and then this girl came in January and undid in 6 weeks a thing I had waited 10 years for. And I sat in a drawing room, and I took true things and set them in a wicked order, and I said them to Sir Gilbert with my own mouth, and it is my doing and no one else's on this earth." And then she looked at the Duke and said the thing that made a good many people in that churchyard forgive her in the end, which was, "And you never said no to me either. In 2 years, Not once, and I would have taken a no. I would have taken it years ago and gone and had a life. But you let me wait at your gate the same as you made everyone wait at yours, and I am done waiting now." And she walked out through the light gate alone, and nobody stopped her, and that was the last time she was ever seen in that parish. Corbin Rook got to his feet with his hat crushed in his hands and said, "Loud enough for the yard, I was to shoot that gray at Lady Day, and this young woman stood in front of the guns and told me he was not mad, but grieving. And she was right in every particular, and she has made him quiet and sound and worth £40 a year to this estate, and I have it in my book, and I was wrong about the horse, and I was wrong about her, and I will say so to any man that wants it said twice." Elias Ganton stood, an old bent man among the graves, and said, "I chained those gates, on the order, with these hands, and I have known it 2 years, and held my tongue. And God forgive me, this child kept a horse alive that I hadn't the courage to, and told a truth I hadn't the courage to, and she is worth the 10 of us." And it was then, in the silence after the old man sat, that a small clear voice came up out of the crowd, from down near the front, where a very small girl in black stood holding the sexton's widow's hand, a voice not one soul in that county had heard in 2 years, and it said one word, and the word was, "Mama." Little Nan had spoken. She had come to the church with the household, and she had heard her uncle say her mother's name aloud for the first time in her memory. And the door in her that had been shut since the black frost had come open at last, the way her father Prouse had always said such doors come open, sideways, when the safe thing finally happens. And she said "Mama," once, into the silence of 400 people. And then she let go of the widow's hand and walked through the lane in the crowd, small and steady, past her uncle, to the back wall by the light gate, and put up her arms to Verity Prouse, and Verity picked her up, and the child put her face in Verity's neck and said, into her collar, so that only Verity heard the second half of it, "Tell the horse." So they told the horse. The whole churchyard came up the hill through the park in the July evening, 400 people, nobody organizing it, the rector in his surplice, and Corbin Rook and Mrs. Yardley weeping openly now, and the old groom and the child on Verity's hip, up to the stable yard. And Elias Ganton went into the harness room and brought out the thing he had kept in a drawer for 2 years and never been able to burn or use, which was a set of black funeral trappings and a length of crepe, and he brought out the dead woman's small cleaned boots off the mounting block. And Verity led the gray out into the middle of the yard, quiet as a lamb in her hand, and they dressed him, the great gray horse, in the black he had been forbidden at the burying, and they set the empty boots backward in the stirrups of the lady's saddle, the toes to the tail, the old way, the riderless horse that walks its master to the grave and is let, at last, to see and to know. And the Duke of Aldermore took the rein from Verity's hand and put his own hand flat on the gray's neck, on the running engine place, though nobody had shown him. And he knocked once with his knuckle on the great gray shoulder the way you knock on a hive or a manger, and he said, in a voice that did not hold and did not need to, her name was Cecily, "She is dead. I am the master now, and you carried her long enough, old man. You may set her down." And the gray stood under the black with his head lowered, and let out a breath, one long, uneven, shuddering sigh of a breath, the setting down of a weight carried alone too long. The same breath he had given Verity at his door on the 12th night of the year, and then he turned his head and looked, once, at the shut window of the west wing, and looked away from it, and did not look at it again, and that was the whole of it, and there was not a dry eye on that slope. The bargain fell due that same evening, because Corbin Rook never let a date go by unsettled. They did it in the library, with the yard book open and a candle at his elbow. One gray hunter condemned Lady Day, respited to the memorial, brought quiet and sound and safe about a child, with a Loughton contract at £40 a year against his name and £5 of earnest on the book. Rook wrote the discharge, read it back, signed it, pushed the book across and said, "There, miss, I have hoped since March you would make a liar of me, and by God you have." The stud money. When it came, the Duke would not keep. The first 3 years of it he sent, with no name to it, to a broken lieutenant in the Indies who had once been beaten in a sunken lane by grooms who took him for a poacher. Because a man cannot give a dead sister back her marriage, but he can stop being the reason it never was. Lady Helena Vaux left the Vale and married a member for a Cornish borough the spring after, and she and Verity never met nor wrote again. But when the first Aldermore child was born there came a parcel from Cornwall with no letter in it, only a length of good grey stuff made up at last into a shawl, which Verity wore 2 years. They were married in the little church at the foot of the park on a May morning, and she brought him 6 shillings, a dead man's coat, a book about horses and a Loughton contract, and the whole county came, because the whole county was not going to miss it, and the small girl walked in front of her, strewing the way and talking the entire time. There is one more thing, and then I will let you go. In the west wing, in the room with the shut window, there is a sea chest with her ladyship's name on a brass plate, and in it, tied in a bundle, every letter a scarred lieutenant ever wrote her, and the Duke has never opened it. And on the day the west wing roof was at last mended, he put the key in Verity's hand and said, "I cannot, but you may if you think it right, and that is another evening. So, here is where I leave you. On a slope in the July dusk, with 400 people weeping in a stable yard, and a great grey horse standing quiet in the black at last. I have thought all week about that old groom, who kept the crape in a drawer 2 years because he was frightened of a man who never once raised his voice, and about the 2 ways there are to carry a thing too heavy to say. You can do what the Duke did, and set it on the shoulders of everyone who loves you, and call it grief. Or you can be the one who walks up at the end and knocks and says it out loud. Tell me which you have been, and if there is somebody in your life who is still, officially, away, you might think on that this week. Next time, I am opening the sea chest, because I want to know what a brave man wrote to her as much as you do. And if you have come this far with us, put in the comments which city you are watching from, because I read every one, and it astonishes me where you are.